underneath the cloak of legend lies a colder truth, one pressed into the very soil these women walked barefoot across each day. The Viking Age woman was neither invisible nor invincible. Her place was marked by contradiction. She held power in the domestic sphere, yet her rights were tethered to the will of men. She could inherit land, yet might be bartered like land herself in political unions. She tended not only to the hearth, but to the pulse of the community, nursing feuds as often as she soothed wounds, while the outside world remembers Viking men for conquest. It was the women who preserved the core of Norse life through the brutal churn of winter and war. Their presence was stitched into every corner of the longhouse. The sagging roof beams she patched with care, the iron cauldron she stirred with scarce grain, the mead she brewed to placate the fragile peace between men who would kill for honor or insult. These women were not only caretakers of life, but guardians of death. It was they who prepared the bodies, dressed the dead in funeral finery, and recited the final words when a warrior fell. A Viking woman's connection to the spiritual world ran deep. She was sometimes seeress, healer, midwife, and mourner, each role drawn from a blend of ancient custom and raw necessity. With hands coarse from labor, she read omens in the smoke. Rising from the hearth, interpreted dreams that unsettled her husband, and drew runes for protection when her children fell ill. Her wisdom was not written down. It was passed through touch and tone, through whispered instruction during childbirth or in the cool dark before the fire lit. And though her name might not endure in stone, her influence is immortal in the rhythm of the lives she shaped. From the moment she could walk, a girl learned what it meant to endure. Her toys mimicked tools, miniature looms, and carved spoons, and by the time she could braid her hair, she was already braiding ropes, stirring porridge, spinning wool. Childhood was brief, and the expectations clear. She would marry, likely in her teens, and not for love, but alliance. Her dowry was more than good. It was a contract, a bond between king groups, often sealed with blood feasts and whispered terms. Yet within this rigid structure, a Viking woman could find leverage. Laws, like the ones recorded in the and Gularing codes, granted her property rights, divorce rights, and protection from certain abuses. A woman could, under the right circumstances, divorce her husband for reasons as specific as his failure to support her, or even his unkempt beard. These rights were rare in much of the medieval world, and yet they were not given freely. They were guarded, clawed into existence by generations of women who asserted themselves not with weapons, but with the quiet, firm insistence of their presence. That presence extended beyond the home. Women managed farms, while husbands fought, oversaw the slaves and bondservants who maintained the household, and kept the economy of the homestead alive through weaving, brewing, dairy work, and trade. Some accompanied their men on voyages, both eastward into the Russ lands and westward into the fog-bound isles of Britain and beyond. Archaeological finds in Birka, Oseberg, and other Norse burial sites reveal women laid to rest with the same honor as chieftains' grave goods that hint not only at wealth, but status and significance. One woman was buried with weapons, another with a wagon fit for a queen. Whether these were symbolic or literal reflections of their roles remains debated, but their graves speak louder than the sagas, which often reduced women to love interests, or mothers unless they bled into legend. Still, in the sagas, we hear their voices. Gudrun, whose life was defined by vengeance and sorrow. Halgara, proud and manipulative, yet shrewd in the politics of marriage. Aud the deep-minded, who crossed The sea, too, found a dynasty in Iceland. These were not fantasies, they were reflections, sometimes distorted, of real powers women could hold when wealth, wit, and circumstance aligned. Even the feared image of the shield maiden, half legend, half truth, remains, rooted in the idea that women, if driven far enough, could bear arms and command respect on the battlefield. Yet most did not fight with swords. They fought with silence, with diplomacy, with bitter resilience forged over years of watching suns die and land dry up and feasts turn into funerals. To live as a Viking woman was to walk a knife's edge between reverence and restriction. Her voice mattered, especially in matters of inheritance, domestic decisions, or clan disputes. At the wing, the great assemblies, where laws were spoken aloud and judgments passed, a woman could not stand as lawgiver, but her testimony could shape verdicts. She could not be jarl or king, but she could influence them through her sons, her wealth, or her alliances. Marriage was a game of stakes and strategy, and clever women played it with as much calculation as their male counterparts. They understood the power of reputation, of honor, of kinship ties stronger than iron. What life was like for women in Viking times was not defined by extremes, but by the in-between, between field and fjord, between hearth and high seat, between subjugation and sovereignty. Their names may be missing from the rune stones, but their legacies ripple beneath the surface, woven into linen threads, echoed in family sagas, burned into the bone of daily life. To understand them is to understand the heart of the Viking world, not as a battlefield, but as a longhouse where survival depended as much on birth and bread as on blades. They were the pulse behind the myth, the first cry of a child in a Viking household did not guarantee life, only its fragile beginning. Birth in Viking Scandinavia took place most often in the dim warmth of a longhouse, far from the aid of physicians, guided instead by women whose knowledge came not from books but blood and memory. The midwives experienced mothers or elder. Women of the settlement relied on old techniques, charms, and herbal salves to coax the infant into the world. The smell of iron and damp wool, the flicker of firelight, and the low, urgent prayers to the gods created an atmosphere half sacred, half perilous. Every birth was a gamble. The cold outside was merciless. An infection or weakness inside could take both mother and child within hours. Still, among those who survived, the beginning of life was marked with quiet ceremony. If the child lived past those first hours, she would be examined for strength, clear eyes, strong lungs, movement of limbs. There was no room in the harsh climate for sentiment without scrutiny. Children who were born sickly or deformed might be left to exposure, a practice mentioned in sagas and corroborated by some burial patterns, though its frequency remains uncertain. What is known is that survival had to be earned quickly. If she lived, the baby girl would be named on the 9th day, during a ritual known as the Nafnasti. This naming day was more than administrative, it was a rite of recognition. A few drops of water were sprinkled on her forehead, a distant cousin of later Christian baptism, and her name was spoken aloud, often chosen to honor a relative or ancestor. Through this name, she became part of the kin group, tied to its fate, history, and honor. Naming had weight. Names were thought to carry power. A girl was named after a respected matriarch. It was hoped she would embody her strength or wisdom. Some names referenced goddesses or invoked protection, while others were blunt reflections of traits or aspirations. The name was not just for identification, but for calling, invoking, linking the child to her lineage. And in this act, she was both individual and extension herself and her people. Her earliest days were spent wrapped in wool or animal skins, swaddled against the biting chill. Viking cradles, reconstructed from burial sites and sagas, were simple wooden troughs padded with straw, moss, or down when available. In wealthier households, carved cradles with decorative motifs might signal the status of the child's family, though comfort was secondary to utility. Small carved amulets, often of Thor's hammer or animals associated with protection, were placed near the infant or sewn into her garments. These charms, rooted in Norse belief systems, were thought to ward off illness and malevolent spirits. The line between the natural and supernatural was porous, and an infant's survival often felt like a negotiation with forces beyond control. Infancy bled quickly into responsibility. As soon as a child could walk steadily, she began to learn. By imitation, little girls watched their mothers spin wool, weave cloth, mend nets, and prepare meals. They learned to recognize the sounds of livestock distress, the correct way to carry a bucket without spilling, and how to tend to younger siblings. Toys, when they existed, reflected this world. Archaeologists have uncovered tiny looms, wooden animals, carved dolls, and even miniature swords and tools none mass-produced, but lovingly shaped by a parent or sibling. These were not just playthings, but early instruments of Through play, she rehearsed her future. Even the games carried undertones of training. Girls played house, but they also engaged in contests of strength and agility. In some regions, especially Iceland, both boys and girls participated in swimming, climbing, and running games. Physical competence was admired in both sexes. Though the purposes diverged, boys were trained for raids and battle, while girls were molded into the future keepers of the farmstead, the home, and the fragile thread of generational continuity. A girl's body was trained not just for labor, but for endurance of childbirth, of hunger, of the long winters that took more than they gave. What a girl wore marked her place. From the youngest age, clothing was gendered. She would wear simple linen or wool tunics, sometimes belted, with practical shoes fashioned from hide. As she aged, more complex garments were introduced, brooches, and the distinctive oval tortoise brooches that came to symbolize womanhood in Norse society. Jewelry was more than decoration, it was declaration. It signaled not only age and wealth, but status, family ties, and sometimes religious leanings. A tiny child might wear a small Thor's hammer necklace, signaling allegiance to the old gods, or, in later centuries, a cross to reflect Christian conversion. These details were fluid, especially in border regions, but always meaningful. Education was not institutional. There were no schools for girls. Their learning came through proximity, repetition, and oral tradition. Aunts, grandmothers, mothers, and older siblings passed on stories, superstitions, skills, and songs. Through lullabies and work chants, a girl learned history and morality. The sagas that would later be committed to vellum were first housed in the mouths of women, told over spinning wheels and boiling pots. In this oral economy, memory was a woman's currency. Her place within the family, however, was double-edged. Viking society, though more egalitarian than some contemporaries, still placed women below men in terms of formal authority. A daughter was a liability or an asset depending on what she brought to the clan, her marriageability, her dowry, and the alliances she might secure. But even within this framework, affection was not absent. Sagas occasionally hint at tender relationships between fathers and daughters, and poetry praises beloved wives and sisters. Affection was not incompatible with pragmatism, it simply coexisted with it, often in tension. As she grew older, her tasks increased. By age 7, many girls were helping with milking, feeding animals, gathering herbs, and spinning yarn. By 10 or 11, she might be trusted with cooking, watching infants, or tending small plots of vegetables. By 12 or 13, she was considered on the threshold of marriageability, and her body became both her own and not her own. Puberty was not discussed in clinical terms, but its arrival was marked. A girl whose menstruation began was now capable of childbearing a fact, not lost on the community. Her value changed, and so did the gaze of those around her. This period between girlhood and marriage was narrow. For some, betrothals were arranged before puberty. Marriages could be formalized by 14 or 15. These unions were rarely about love. They were political, economic, and social strategies agreed upon by fathers, brothers, and clan leaders. Still, a girl was not always voiceless. In some regions and under certain laws, a woman had the right to reject a suitor, though this was more a privilege of the wealthy or well-connected, and yet the sagas often depict women resisting unions they find unsuitable, suggesting that even within constraint, resistance was possible. What mattered most was that she carried forward the bloodline. A Viking girl who became a woman through marriage or childbirth was expected to embody continuity. She would link families, birth children, tend to land and livestock, and perform the rituals that kept the gods, ancestors, and household spirits satisfied. And all of this had its roots in the girlhood she had just left behind, a training ground not of books or classrooms, but of wool, fire, and frost. But not every girl lived to see that transformation. Infant and child mortality rates were brutal. Archaeological remains show signs of malnutrition, illness, and injury among young skeletons. Graves of young girls sometimes contain small toys or beads, suggesting love and mourning, but also a resignation to loss. The fragility of life was embedded into the Viking worldview. The gods themselves faced inevitable death, so what hope did mortals have? Yet, in response to this impermanence, Viking families poured meaning into what years they had. A child's laugh in a longhouse was not just a sound, it was hope, a stave against the dark. Some girls, of course, grew outside the expected lines. There were those who, through wealth, inheritance, or sheer will, avoided early marriage or gained authority in their own right. Others, perhaps those born into households with no surviving sons, were taught skills usually reserved for boys. The lines were flexible at their edges, and there is evidence, both literary and material, of women who wielded power, land, and even violence when required. But for most, girlhood followed a script written in hardship and silence. Still, it is in that silence that their voices can sometimes be heard. In the wear pattern of loom weights in old farmsteads, in the soot lining the inside of cauldrons that fed whole families, in the strands of hair found twisted into old combs and beads. The physical traces of girlhood may be few, but they are unmistakable. They speak of endurance, of quiet preparation, of the slow, constant shaping of life against the pressure of cold and custom. And so, from the moment of her naming to the moment her body became the site of new beginnings, the Viking girl was not simply a passive vessel of culture. She was its bearer. Her earliest breath carried the cold air of her ancestors. and her first steps were taken across land that demanded strength from even the smallest feet. She entered womanhood not by declaration, but by function. One morning she was spinning wool beside her mother. The next, she was addressed with new expectation in the eyes of her kin. A Viking girl's transition into a Viking woman rarely came with ceremony either. It was marked by an accumulation of responsibilities that quietly shifted the rhythms of her daily life. She no longer merely helped, she decided. Her voice in the longhouse began to carry weight, and in time, she might become a husfrog, the lady of the house, not through pomp, but through the quiet consolidation of command over the space where life was sustained. The longhouse was more than shelter, it was an organism pulsing with heat, smoke, labor, and the overlapping lives of people and animals. In its wooden bones, the woman reigned. The hearth at the center was both literal and symbolic. From its flames came warmth, cooked food, healing teas, and the embers that were never allowed to die out. Its maintenance was her duty, and with it came unspoken dominion over all that radiated from it. While her husband might possess the sword or steer the ship, she held the keys and often wore them prominently at her belt. These keys were not ornamental. They unlocked chests of silver, stores of dried meats, looms, and rooms that held the family's most critical goods. To hold the keys was to hold continuity. No outsider entered the household without her consent. Guests were greeted with offerings. She arranged bowls of curds, smoked fish, bread dark with grain, and ale she had brewed herself. She controlled the stores, and with them, the rhythms of feast and famine. Her sense of planning and provision determined whether a family would survive lean winters or suffer from hunger. In this space, her authority could be absolute, and it was here that the daily rituals of Viking survival unfolded under her command. The economy of the household was complex. Viking society relied not solely on raids or trade, but on the internal economy of farms, homesteads, and steads managed by women. Textile production alone was a task of staggering scale. From the shearing of sheep to the spinning of wool, from dyeing threads to weaving cloth, each stage required skill, time, and cooperation. Loom weights, spindle whorls, and weaving swords uncovered in archaeological digs speak to the immense labor invested in creating everything from everyday tunics to the sailcloths that drove Viking ships across open seas. These sails, woven by women, were not just fabric, they were freedom and fortune. The wealth of a family might literally rest in the strength of its cloth. To control textiles was to control value. Cloth was a currency, traded as readily as silver or furs. A husfrog might oversee not only the making of clothing for her own family, but the production of goods for market exchange. In areas with developed trade networks, such as Hadibi or Rib, women played integral roles in the local economy through these crafts. The marketplace, often imagined as male-dominated, included women selling woolen goods, dairy products, dyed threads, and herbal remedies. These women negotiated, bartered, and judged quality with trained eyes. Food preparation was equally vital. It was not merely the task of stirring pots. It was a daily act of preservation and calibration. Women knew which herbs treated which ailments, which grains kept longest, which days were best for butchering. Drying, salting, fermenting, and storing food required a keen understanding of cycles and spoilage. They were the unseen engineers of sustenance. They adapted to the seasons, stretched resources, and passed on techniques as quietly as they passed on songs, The line between feeding and healing often blurred, and many women were both cooks and herbalists, caretakers of both stomach and spirit. Leadership within the home often extended outward. If the man of the house was away on trade voyages, in warbands, or lost at sea, was the husfrok, who became the de facto head of the household. She directed farmhands and slaves, mediated disputes, and sometimes even represented her family's interests at local assemblies or in legal matters. Though the public assembly was male-dominated, women could be active indirectly through kinship networks or through their sons and stewards. Their knowledge of land boundaries, livestock inventories, and resource flows often surpassed that of the men who ruled on paper. Social authority could be subtle or sharp. In the home, women managed not only goods, but people servants, children, and sometimes the enslaved. This hierarchy was not without cruelty. Female slaves, often captured in raids, might serve beneath a husfrok in roles of grinding grain, fetching water, or bearing children for their masters. Within the walls of the longhouse, the woman of the house wielded power over these lives too. Her dominance in this domain was unchallenged, and while her own position was shaped by patriarchy, she too could enforce its structures on others. Ritual and religion were also part of her sphere. While men led sacrifices and public rites, it was often women who maintained the household cults, small altars, ancestor tokens, and rituals of fertility and protection. Seer, a form of Norse magic associated with fate and foresight, was traditionally practiced by women. The vulva, a wandering seeress, was revered and feared, often consulted before journeys or battles. Though not every woman practiced magic, the association between the feminine and the mystical imbued even domestic acts with spiritual undertones. A prayer whispered while kneading dough, a protective rune scratched into the doorframe, or a charm buried beneath a cradle, all belonged to a sacred domestic vocabulary. Marriage further elevated or constrained her power. A well-matched husband could wield considerable influence, especially if she brought land, wealth, or status into the union. Dowries were not simply gifts, they were strategic assets, and in many regions, the dowry remained under the woman's control even after marriage. The morgengeb, or morning gift, was given by the husband to the wife the day after marriage, a public recognition of her new authority. These gifts could include silver, livestock, or land, and were hers by right. The authority of the husfrek extended even after death. Inheritance laws varied across regions, but in many cases, daughters could inherit if there were no sons. Widows often retained control of household property and could remarry, sometimes strategically. A powerful widow might even command more respect than a young, inexperienced husband. The sagas are filled with widows who navigate power structures, with shrewdness, commanding loyalty, orchestrating vengeance, or securing alliances. Their homes became centers of influence long after their husbands were gone. Respect for this role was not purely practical, it was cultural. Poetry and saga literature reflect admiration for women who embodied the virtues of the husfrok: wisdom, frugality, strength, and hospitality. A woman who managed her household well was praised just as surely as a warrior who fought bravely. Hospitality, in particular, was a sacred duty. A stingy or inhospitable woman could shame her household, while a generous husfrok brought honor to her name. This virtue was a performance of power, a quiet assurance that the household was well fed, well managed, and rich enough to spare. But alongside admiration came expectation. The husfrok carried the burden of continuity. If food ran short, if cloth was poorly woven, if guests were mistreated, the fault was hers. Her success was communal, but her failure personal. Her labor was constant and rarely praised openly. Her authority was unquestioned in her sphere, but that sphere remained bounded by the longhouse walls. Outside them, she had to negotiate power, differently through kin, favor, and alliance. Even within her domain, she was not always safe. Domestic violence existed. Saga texts speak of wives beaten or mistreated, though legal codes in places like Iceland did allow women to divorce men for abuse or neglect. A woman could leave a marriage if her husband struck her 3 times or failed to provide for her. These protections, while progressive compared to other medieval societies, were unevenly enforced and often dependent on a woman's family support. A poor woman, or one without brothers, might have little recourse. Authority in the home did not always equate to personal security. Still, most women carved out dignity within these parameters. They trained daughters to carry the same burden, passed on their knowledge without need for written texts, and shaped households that formed the spine of Norse society. Their labor was invisible only to those who looked for glory in the wrong places. It was not in the clang of swords, but in the hum of the loom and the hiss of meat cooking over fire that Viking civilization sustained itself. The image of the shieldmaiden endures because it is rare and glamorous, but it is the husfrak who governed most lives. She held the rhythms of birth and death, feast and famine, silence and speech. In a world where male power was performative, hers was enduring. Her memory was preserved not in battle songs, but in recipes passed down, in burial goods wrapped in fine cloth, in the deep grooves of combs worn smooth by daily use. Her strength was measured not by how she killed, but by how she kept others alive, and though her world was limited in scope, its influence was vast. The fire she tended burned for everyone. By the time a girl became a woman in the eyes of her community, her fate had already begun to coil around the question of marriage. It was not love that drove such unions, nor even desire, though both could find their place within the contract. Rather, it was land, lineage, and obligation threads woven long before the girl had any voice in the matter. Marriage among the Vikings was first and foremost a political maneuver, a binding of families and fortunes that affected more than just the bride and groom. A well-made match could end a blood feud, secure a trade route, or bring legitimacy to a land claim. In this delicate dance of kinship and gain, the woman was the bridge, but she was never merely passive. Courtship, if the term can be used, was not a fluttering game of affections. It was negotiation. Fathers or male guardians took the lead, often consulting with elders, matchmakers, or local chieftains to assess potential spouses. The bride and groom might meet briefly or not at all before the arrangement was struck. The process was transactional, formalized through 2 essential components, the munda and the hymenfylgja. The munda was the bride price paid by the groom's family to the bride's. It symbolized not the purchase of a woman, but the recognition of her value and the seriousness of the union. The hymenfylgja, by contrast, was the dowry, property and goods the bride brought with her into the marriage. Both were publicly recorded, often in front of witnesses at a local assembly, ensuring the terms were honored. These ceremonies had ritual weight. The exchange of gifts, the recitation of oaths, and the drinking of ale marked a wedding not just as celebration but as contract. The gods were invoked, and the community present, for marriage was a public bond, not a private affair. Women were adorned in their best garments, often rich with embroidered patterns and silver jewelry, and at her waist hung the ceremonial keys of her new household. They clinked as she walked, a promise of future responsibility, and yet, within this transactional structure, the woman was not without agency. While arranged marriages were common, the Icelandic GRG's law code, among others, required a woman's consent to finalize a union. This consent might be pressured or assumed in practice, but its legal requirement opened a small space for negotiation or refusal. In some sagas, we see women exercising this right, refusing suitors, challenging paternal choices, or manipulating the terms of engagement. The law allowed for resistance, and clever women found ways to use it. Love, though not essential, was not absent. Some marriages blossomed into affection, others into partnership born of mutual respect. The sagas, while dramatized, offer glimpses into such dynamics. A woman might advise her husband, chide him for foolish decisions, or steer his path through her insight. Her influence was often domestic, but not trivial. In her words and counsel, she could shape alliances, encourage vengeance, or broker peace. Her intelligence, her tongue, and her silence all were instruments of power. Still, not all unions thrived. Viking society recognized the fallibility of marriage and made room for its dissolution. Divorce was not rare, nor necessarily shameful. A woman could initiate it on various grounds. If her husband was abusive, if he failed to provide, if he brought shame, or even if he neglected personal grooming, an unkempt beard or slovenly appearance could be cited as cause in some regions. To divorce, she need only declare the separation publicly, often in the doorway or at the household's central seat with witnesses present. The act was simple, but its consequences could be far-reaching. Children were typically divided between the households, depending on their age and the terms agreed upon. A woman retained her dowry and any personal goods not gifted to the husband, and in some cases she might reclaim her mortgagab, depending on the circumstances. Remarriage was possible for both parties, and many did remarry, often quickly. The looseness of these social bonds, compared to later Christian norms, reflected a cultural pragmatism. Marriage was a tool, not a sacrament. However, divorce could be dangerous. A poorly handled separation might reignite old feuds or dishonor a family, and while the legal structures existed, they could be undermined by the raw force of clan politics. A woman with strong brothers or a respected lineage was more likely to be heard, her claims upheld, her person protected. A woman alone or one whose kin were weak might be ignored, abused, or quietly silenced. Legal rights were one thing, the ability to enforce them another entirely. Yet the sagas are filled with examples of women who outwitted this imbalance. On the deep-minded, for instance, widowed and exiled, crossed the sea with her family's treasure, established a settlement in Iceland, and arranged marriages for her descendants with strategic brilliance. Halgara Langbrak, though infamous for her manipulations, displayed a fierce independence, choosing husbands, controlling her own fate, and daring to challenge even her husband's pride. These were not idealized figures, but reminders that wit could be a weapon as deadly as any axe. Even in tales where women suffered, their voices resonated. Gudrun, Osvi whose life was marred by tragedy, loss, and vengeance, remained a central force in the Lagstila saga, not because she was a warrior, but because she maneuvered through the complex web of kinship and grief with an intelligence that endured long after the men around her died by the sword. Her marriages, her sorrows, Her acts of revenge painted the portrait of a woman negotiating power in a world that offered few safety nets, but many sharp paths. Marriage, then, was not simply a binding, it was a battlefield. A woman entered it with gifts and burdens, with obligations and opportunities. The ceremonial elements veiled the deeper calculations at work. Who would control the land? Who would bear heirs? Who would speak for the family at the thing? Who would remember the dead and uphold the honor of the line? Her role was more than reproductive, it was political, social, and economic. And her success was measured not just by children born, but by alliances secured and peace maintained. And this peace was fragile. A poorly chosen marriage could undo years of quiet diplomacy. A mismatched bride could inflame old grudges or introduce new enemies into the fold. Women, especially those with a strategic mind, knew this well. Some took it upon themselves to arrange matches for their children or even their kin, ensuring that the bloodlines flowed in directions that suited their broader goals. The longhouse was their council chamber, the hearth their courtroom, and the marriage bed a place not just of intimacy, but of influence. The weaving of families through marriage paralleled the weaving of cloth, intricate, layered, deliberate. And just as the Husrock managed her loom with care, she managed her family's connections with equal precision. The ability to sense a rising feud, to anticipate a rival's move, to redirect affections or resentments before they ignited these, were talents as valuable as any weapon. For every sword drawn in Viking history, there were countless words spoken by women behind closed doors, smoothing what might have cracked. And in this space between public contract and private life, women also carved out something more personal. Poetry from the skaldic tradition hints at passion, longing, jealousy. Some verses are love poems, others laments of betrayal or absence. Though penned by men, many of these compositions channel a feminine voice, suggesting an awareness of women's emotional interiority. While daily life was harsh and the social expectations rigid, the emotional lives of women were not silenced. They bled into song, into lullabies, into whispered stories passed from mother to daughter, into private rituals of grief or hope. The emotional cost of marriage could be high. Childbirth, loss, loneliness, betrayals, these wore against the fabric of a woman's soul just as surely as frost against timber. A man might be killed in battle and remembered in glory. A woman might die in childbirth and be buried quietly under the earth she had tended. And yet her memory could persist, not in stone carvings, but in the stories told beside fires, in the names given to daughters, in the strength of a household that endured because of her. The rituals of marriage might have been about contract and clang, but within them pulsed human vulnerability. A woman entered the union not knowing whether she would be cherished, used, or forgotten. And still, she entered, not as a silent figurehead, but as a calculated actor, bringing with her not only wool and silver, but memory, lineage, and presence. She was expected to carry burdens, but she also carried the ability to shift the course of her household's history, one quiet decision at a time. She did not wake one day as a mother. Instead, the role was layered upon her gradually through the hush of preparation, the gathering of herbs, the tightening of her body as it adapted to the weight it carried. From the moment the signs appeared, the mist bleeding, the slow swell of her belly, she entered into a state that was both sacred and dangerous. In Viking society, pregnancy was not cloaked in sentimentality. It was a raw confrontation with mortality. To bring forth life meant to stand at the threshold of death. and every woman who became pregnant knew that stepping through that door might cost her everything. The expectations began early. From her first days as a wife, the assumption of fertility shadowed her. A childless woman was considered unfortunate, sometimes suspect. Her value, though not entirely bound to her womb, was inextricably tied to her ability to produce heirs, especially sons. But even daughters could secure the continuity of a household, forge new alliances through marriage, and offer labor to a farmstead that needed every hand. A woman who gave birth was fulfilling not only a personal role but a communal duty. Her children would carry the name, till the soil, avenge wrongs, and inherit the land. The pressure to conceive was quiet but unrelenting, and her body was measured through this lens. Once a woman's condition became apparent, the nature of her daily work shifted. Heavy labor was reduced, though not entirely avoided. There were no luxuries of idleness. She still spun wool, prepared food, tended livestock, and soothed other children, but now with more eyes on her, more caution in each movement. Other women in the household, especially elder ones or those who had borne children themselves, became a quiet circle of watchers and advisors. The passing of knowledge was not done in formal lessons. It came through glances, gestures, hushed warnings, how to sleep, what to eat, when to drink certain brews. This oral tradition was all the expectant mother had. There were no medical texts, no trained doctors. Her safety depended on the experience of those around her and on the favor of the gods. When the time came, there were no sterile rooms, no trained physicians or surgical tools. Childbirth happened in the home, sometimes in the main room near the hearth, other times in a small side chamber if privacy allowed. The birthing space was prepared by women, alone men were rarely present. A midwife, often the most experienced woman of the household or the village, took the lead. She had no formal title, but her presence was vital. She brought with her knowledge gained from decades of deliveries, of deaths and survivals, of when to intervene and when to wait. She might carry a pouch of herbs, yarrow to ease bleeding, raspberry leaf to stimulate contractions, angelica to ward off infection. Some women clutched amulets or called upon Freya or Frigg, praying for strength, endurance, or simply mercy. The labor could last hours or days. It could begin with manageable discomfort and end in screaming, in blood, in breathless panic. Or it could pass quietly, swiftly, without incident. There was no predicting. Midwives might use massage, heat from stones, or positioning techniques passed down through generations to assist the process. The woman labored often in a squatting or seated position, gripping ropes, hands, or beams as waves of pain took her. She might have other women around her offering chants, wet cloths, whispered encouragement, or simply presence. Silence, too, was sometimes a comforter, solemn recognition that this was a moment held between life and death. When the child came forth, it was greeted with both wonder and vigilance. The cord was cut with a knife heated in fire. The infant was examined for signs of health, color, breath, movement. If the baby cried, it was a hopeful sound. If not, the midwife might blow into its mouth, rub it with cloths, or whisper protective words. The dead were mourned immediately, but the living mother and child were not yet safe. Bleeding, fever, or retained birth matter could still claim the mother hours or days after delivery. The threat did not end with the birth cry. If the child survived, the mother's next days were spent in recovery, surrounded by women who ensured her bed remained warm, her food nourishing, her body resting. But rest was relative. Depending on the household's needs, she might resume duties within days. There was no standardized postpartum period. How long she stayed in bed, how gently she was treated, depended on her status, the season, and the demands of survival. In wealthier homes, she might be afforded more help. In poorer ones, she might rise too soon, risking her recovery, simply because there was no alternative. Milk, too, was uncertain. Some women could not produce enough, or any at all. Wet nursing by another woman in the village was possible, but not always available. Infants who could not be fed were given thin porridge or animal milk alternatives that carried their own dangers. Illness could come swiftly, and death was frequent. Graves across Norse territories hold the remains of women still bearing unborn children or buried alongside their newborns, a chilling testament to the risks they faced. These double graves speak louder than any saga, reminding us that for every healthy child who grew to wield a sword or stir a pot, there were many who never took a second breath. Yet despite this looming danger, motherhood was not only seen as burden or sacrifice, it was also a form of legacy, of fulfillment. The mother's identity expanded with each child. She was no longer merely wife, daughter, or husfrack. She was more Ea, the life-giver. And in this, there was pride. Songs were sung to lull children to sleep, not with whimsy, but with warnings and promises of wolves, of frost, of strength to come. A woman taught her children how to speak and how to remember. She passed on not just skills, but values, names, enmities, dreams. For the mother of a daughter, the cycle repeated. She would guide the girl through childhood, through the early bleak of adolescence, through the heavy expectation of marriage. For the mother of a son, there was both pride and fear he would one day be a man, and thus subject to all the glories and dangers manhood entailed. Some mothers grew hardened by these cycles, others quieter, but all were shaped by them. Not all women bore children. Some, by choice or misfortune, remained without offspring. These women did not vanish into insignificance. In many cases, they became midwives themselves, aunts, caretakers, or leaders of their household in other ways. Their experience, unbroken by the toll of pregnancy, might be channeled into governance of the home, management of slaves, or involvement in broader kinship negotiations. Still, the absence of children could provoke whispers, especially in communities where survival relied so heavily on numbers. For those who had lost children, and they were many, the grief was often private, but not invisible. Small burial sites sometimes include toys, beads, or fragments of cloth beside tiny bones. These were not practical goods. They were tokens of love, of sorrow, of memory. A woman might place a carved animal with her dead child as both comfort and offering. She might wear a bead in mourning, or speak to the spirit of the child in moments of solitude. There was no formal system of psychological healing, no therapy, but grief was carried, folded into the fabric of daily life. Medical remedies were limited and largely herbal. Women who survived multiple births were sometimes called upon to aid others, even if they were not midwives by practice. They became repositories of knowledge: how to soothe a fever with willow bark, how to ease cramps with mugwort, how to reduce swelling with cold compresses or ashes. These methods were not always effective, but they were all that stood between life and death in many cases. The body was treated with reverence, but also practicality. It was seen as a vessel of function. sacred in purpose but fragile in design. The threat of death never fully faded. Even years after childbirth, complications could arise. Infections, weakened organs, or repeated pregnancies wore the body down. Some women aged swiftly, not from years but from the toll of reproduction. Yet they carried on rocking cradles, preparing meals, mentoring younger women. Each new birth reminded the community not only of renewal but of the narrow pledge between continuation and collapse. Mothers were remembered. Their names might be forgotten by the world beyond their kin, but their essence remained in the way there. Children spoke, in the habits passed down, in the structures they built through repetition and resilience. In the quiet rituals around birth and death, they were central. And though Viking society often valorized the deeds of men, it was these women wrung out from labor, stained with blood, bent from care who truly ensured the next generation lived to carve new stories into the frost. Even as the cries of newborns softened into sleep and the house returned to its rhythm, the hands of Viking women rarely rested. There was always something that needed shaping. After childbirth, after the feast, after the harvest, there was the wool. The silence of the hearth, the stillness of the evening. The lull between storms all were filled with the rhythmic spin of the spindle, the steady creak of the loom. This labor did not draw the awe of raiding or the drama of politics, but it forged something deeper than reputation. In thread and fabric, women wove power. The textile economy of Viking Age Scandinavia was massive. It extended far beyond household use and far beyond the perception of mere domesticity. Wool, linen, and imported silks were more than clothing. They were a currency, a resource, a signal. And it was women through their fingers, through their craft, through their decisions who controlled this economy from the ground up. Every thread began at the source. Sheep were sheared in the spring, their fleece sorted by texture and length, and cleaned with painstaking effort. Coarse wool was used for cloaks or sails, finer strands for underclothes or trade goods. Women managed this entire cycle. After washing and drying the fleece, they carded it, teasing out knots with combs made of bone or wood, then spun it into thread using whirls and spindles that archaeological digs have uncovered in thousands. Each was uniquely shaped, some plain and utilitarian, others carved with care, weighted precisely to match the spinner's preferred rhythm. Spinning was constant. Women carried their distaffs as they walked, talked, or waited. It was a portable craft, integrated into life the way breathing was. Children watched their mothers spin, girls learned early, and grandmothers passed on not just techniques but judgment, how to feel the tension in a strand, how to recognize wool that would stretch, snap, or hold. This process, though slow and often overlooked, generated the raw material for everything that clothed the body, covered the bed, or carried the wind. Once spun, the thread was dyed if wealth or purpose demanded it. Common hues like brown and grey were left natural. Brighter shades required preparation. Madder, root for red, woad for blue, birch for yellow. The process of dyeing required not only knowledge of plants and seasons, but a strong grasp of chemistry, though they would not have called it that. It involved soaking, boiling, binding. Some dyes required fermenting in urine. Others demanded mordants like alum or iron. The complexity of color was a status marker. To wear vivid fabric was to speak silently of labor, of trade connections, of wealth. From here thread passed to the loom. Unlike the modern horizontal looms, the Viking loom was upright, a warp-weighted frame that stood like a doorway in the corner of the house. Threads were hung from the top beam and held taut by clay or stone weights at the bottom. The woman sat or stood before it, shifting the threads with a heddle rod and pressing the weft in with a weaving sword. The work was deliberate and exhausting. A single textile could take months. Yet this slowness was also where power accumulated. Every finished piece was a product not just of skill, but of memory, patience, and foresight. The sailcloths that powered Viking ships were themselves a marvel. Of this economy, made of tightly woven wool, treated with lanolin-rich fat to repel water, they required an enormous amount of raw material and labor. It's estimated that outfitting a single ship might consume the work of many women over a year or more. These sails were sometimes owned communally or sponsored by wealthy households. In either case, their creation was entrusted to women whose expertise ensured not only beauty but durability. To weave a sail was to stitch the fate of voyages, whether for trade or conquest, to a fabric that bore the weight of ambition. Weaving was also artistic. Patterns woven into fabric carried meaning: geometric shapes, repeating motifs, knots, spirals. Some were purely aesthetic, others possibly symbolic. Scholars still debate the meaning of certain designs found in burial textiles or preserved in bogs. But what is clear is that these women were not simply laborers, they were designers. Their choices spoke of taste, intent, perhaps even protection. A tunic with a particular band of trim might declare loyalty, region, or clan. A child's blanket might be edged with motifs meant to ward off ill spirits. Women's control over textiles translated into tangible economic influence. In marketplaces like Burka, Hidibi, and Kopang, women were active vendors of cloth, thread, garments, and tools. They negotiated prices, bartered for goods, and evaluated quality. To be a woman at market was to be a businesswoman. Cloth was often exchanged alongside silver, and in some regions it became a de facto currency, especially in rural areas where coinage was rare. A length of woven fabric could buy livestock, food, or passage. To control its production was to command a form of wealth. This economic role left clear archaeological traces. Graves of Viking women, especially those of higher status, often include tools of the textile trade. Spindle whorls placed near the hip, loom weights at the feet, weaving swords beside the hands. These were not accidental inclusions. They were tokens of identity, a final mark of what the woman had done in life. Some graves even contain elaborate distaffs, wrapped in silver wire or capped with decorative knobs. These were not simply tools, they were symbols. Just as a warrior might be buried with a sword, a powerful woman was laid to rest with the instrument of her craft. The presence of silk in female burials is another telling sign. Though silk was imported from the east through trade routes that stretched as far as Byzantium and beyond, its stitching and use were local. Women who handled such materials knew their value. They integrated silk into trim, into embroidery, sometimes into burial clothes. Its inclusion in a grave signaled both wealth and reach. This woman, the grave declared, was part of a network that spanned the known world. The burial site at Oseberg, perhaps the most famous female grave in the Viking world, offers a stunning example of this textile prestige. The Oseberg queen, her exact identity still debated, was interred in a ship, burial rich with woven goods, embroidery, and tools. The fragments of fabric discovered there reveal a level of technical mastery unmatched in other finds. Patterned tablet weaving, dyed threads, intricate designs. Her body was wrapped in layers of cloth that had been carefully folded, preserved and prepared. If her sword had been her loom, her battlefield the marketplace of cloth and power. Such graves speak not only of what these women did, but of how they were perceived. Textile production was not a lesser form of work, it was central to the identity of a powerful woman. Her loom was a structure of economic and cultural command. Her spindle was a tool of transformation, turning raw fleece into garments that protected, identified, and enriched. Her choices about color, design, distribution echoed far beyond the walls of her home. The communal aspect of textile work also reinforced female social bonds. Weaving was often done in groups. Women sang as they spun, shared stories as they dyed cloth, passed on techniques to daughters and nieces. These gatherings created not just thread, but memory-woven networks of trust, inheritance, and identity. In a society where male alliances were forged through blood and blade, women built theirs through shared labor and the quiet power of consistency. This labor was not always romantic. It was grueling, repetitive, and constant. The work never truly ended. Children always needed clothes. Trade partners demanded goods. The weather ruined the finest wool if not treated properly. A mistake in the warp could ruin a month's effort. A dye batch gone wrong wasted costly plants. But with each thread spun, a woman reinforced her household strength, even among slaves or lower-class women. Textile skills could offer value. An enslaved woman with knowledge of spinning or weaving was more valuable to her owner, and sometimes her labor could elevate her status within the household. In rare cases, such expertise could become a path toward manumission or preferential treatment. Textile knowledge, even at the margins of society, remained potent. In literature, the symbolic resonance of weaving appeared as well. Fate itself was imagined as a tapestry woven by the Norns, female beings who controlled destiny by spinning the thread of each life. This imagery reinforced the cultural association between women, weaving, and power over life and time. Just as the Norns spun the destiny of gods and men, so too did mortal women spin the fabric of their families' fates. Their tools were humble, but their reach was mythic, and so, even as the world beyond the longhouse valorized warriors and kings, within the home and across the trade routes, it was the weavers who secured survival, status, and memory. Their hands worked quietly, endlessly, but with each thread passed through warp and weft, they laid claim to an enduring kind of influence, practical, intimate, and profound. The authority women held at the loom extended far beyond cloth. Just as their hands shaped the physical fabric of their households, so too did their voices shape the legal and social frameworks that governed Viking life. In a world where might often ruled and reputation echoed louder than written word, the law was a living, breathing force spoken aloud, repeated in gatherings, and upheld by community consensus. And in this context, Viking women held a place that defied many of the limitations later imposed on women in Christianized Europe. They were not mere shadows behind their husbands' rights. They were actors with voices, with legal standing, and with a role, however, hard-won in the structuring of justice. Much of what we know about women's legal rights in the Viking world comes from the preserved law codes of medieval Scandinavia, especially Iceland, SGRGs, and Norway's Gularing and Frostarthing laws. Though compiled slightly after the traditional Viking Age, these texts are rooted in oral laws and customs that were practiced centuries earlier. They reveal a society in which law was not entirely monopolized by men. Women could not only be affected by the law they could act. Within it, inheritance was one of the most visible and tangible ways Viking women exercised legal power. In contrast to many feudal systems where property passed strictly through the male line, Norse law allowed daughters to inherit from their fathers, especially in the absence of sons. If a man died leaving only female children, his estate would be divided among them according to established guidelines. While sons often received larger portions, daughters were not excluded. And crucially, the property a woman received, whether land, livestock, or silver, remained hers. Once married, this property did not automatically transfer to her husband's control. Instead, she retained management over it and could even reclaim it. Upon widowhood or divorce, this legal independence extended into the realm of dowries and bridal gifts. A woman's hymenophilia or dowry followed her into marriage, but it was not absorbed into her husband's estate. It remained legally distinct, to be returned in part if the marriage ended. The Morgengeba morning gift, offered by the husband after the wedding night, was another form of property transferred directly to the wife. These assets, along with her inherited wealth, could be used, loaned, or managed by the woman herself, often with striking autonomy. If her husband died, she became the head of the household in his place, managing laborers, debts, and trade. In such cases, the law did not insert a male relative to take control. It respected her as the legitimate holder of the estate. Equally striking was a woman's right to be a legal witness. This may seem minor at first glance, but within a society that relied on public declarations and communal memory rather than centralized bureaucracies, testimony was foundational. A woman could speak at assemblies things, offer sworn statements, and bear witness to transactions, oaths, or disputes. Her word could sway outcomes, though some legal matters were restricted to male participants, especially those concerning combat or military obligation. Many civil and domestic disputes fell squarely within a woman's reach. For issues of household management, inheritance, marriage, and sexual misconduct, female witnesses were not just permitted but essential. Courtship disputes, in particular, illustrate the complex legal roles women could occupy. If a man attempted to claim a woman as wife without proper agreements or against her will, she could publicly deny the claim. And if the man had taken liberties without consent, her declaration could launch formal proceedings. In such cases, the law required her to make a statement before witnesses, repeating it over 3 days in a public place such as a doorway, or path, affirming that the claim was false and unjust. This ritualized rejection was both symbolic and practical. It protected her honor, preserved her legal status, and often deterred further slander or unwanted advances. Married women also held the right to initiate legal action. If they were wrong through violence, theft, or broken agreements, they could bring a case before the thing, represented by themselves or through male kin. And in some instances, particularly widows or women of high status, they chose to represent themselves. Saga literature offers examples of sharp-tongued women who stood before assemblies to demand justice, shame their accusers, or defend their family's reputation. These were not isolated tales of extraordinary individuals. They reflect broader patterns of accepted female engagement with law and authority. This authority was particularly visible in Iceland, a society shaped by fierce independence, sparse population, and complex kinship networks. Here, households often operated without centralized oversight, relying instead on legal negotiation and collective enforcement. A woman with land, sons, and sharp memory could exert considerable influences, especially if she controlled key testimonies or settlements. In cases of feud or property dispute, her silence could be as potent as her speech. But rights were not evenly distributed. A woman's ability to wield legal power was heavily influenced by her social position. Free women held more rights than slaves or thralls, and class distinction deeply affected practical outcomes. An enslaved woman had virtually no legal personhood. She could not own property, testify, or bring a case. If she was harmed, it was her owner, not she, who received compensation. Even freedwomen, though technically enfranchised, often faced suspicion or limited standing. Still, some rose through resilience and alliances, carving out spaces of recognition over time. One of the most vivid expressions of female legal agency lies in land management. Women did not merely inherit land, they worked it, leased it, sold it. Archaeological records and sagas mention women managing farms, overseeing workers, and negotiating with neighbors. In some regions, a woman could own significant estates and bequeath them according to her will. Testamentary rights were not just for the dying. They reflected a woman's ongoing authority in life. A matriarch might designate which daughter received what field, which son received which tools, which servant stayed in which role. Her decisions shaped generations. The link between land and law was reinforced through rituals. When a woman inherited land, she was expected to walk the bounds, to physically traverse the property, reciting her claim and marking her presence. This performance established legal proof of ownership, witnessed by others in the community. The body became part of the legal document, and in such acts, female presence became publicly inscribed onto the landscape, not just metaphorically, but quite literally. Laws also reflected the cultural expectation of reciprocity and balance. If a woman committed a crime, say theft or assault, she faced punishment like any man of her class. This parity in consequence reinforced a certain parity in rights. She was not excused from responsibility, but she was included in the mechanisms of accountability. Her status as a legal being meant she could be wrong, but also that she could be right, and that justice might be claimed on her behalf. Marriage law offered further insight. As already explored, women could divorce their husbands by public declaration, but what follows is equally revealing. Upon divorce, women retained control over their dowries, often returned with interest if the husband was at fault. They could remarry without requiring male permission, and in some sagas, they maneuvered between marriages with deft, strategic timing. Legal codes even outlined penalties for men who tried to prevent former wives from reclaiming their goods or rights. In a culture that so valued property and legacy, the enforcement of a woman's material entitlements signaled real respect for her standing. There were limits, of course. Women could not hold formal political office, could not perform the blood oath of vengeance, a holmganga, or duel, which often resolved serious disputes, and were rarely appointed as law speakers, the men who memorized and recited the law at assemblies. Their power was shaped through household, kinship, memory, and voice, not through arms or election. But within these bounds, many moved with considerable skill. They knew how to apply pressure, how to recall precedent, how to rally witnesses, or secure mediation. Some women became feared not for their swords, but for their speech. Saga heroines, like Jorun, Bergthor, and Ord, the deep-minded showcase these dimensions. They navigated blood feuds, land disputes, and marriages not as victims, but as negotiators. They wielded law like a tool sometimes, a weapon and understood its nuances better than the men they outmaneuvered. Their stories, though dramatic, are mirrors of the culture that valued legal intelligence as a form of power, and that intelligence was not reserved for men. In this way, Viking women occupied a legal space that was both remarkable and practical. Their rights were not born of ideology or idealism, but of necessity. In a world of shifting alliances, fragile households, and distant authority, the inclusion of women in legal life helped maintain order. A community could not afford to ignore half its population in matters of inheritance, witness, or property. Law had to reflect reality, and the reality was that women were too vital to be excluded. Their words, spoken before doors, in halls, at fences, and in gatherings, became part of the record. Not the written record, perhaps, but the remembered one, the stories passed from mouth to mouth, preserved in sagas, and later inscribed into law codes that astonish modern readers with their relative inclusivity. It was not equality as we understand it today, but it was agency, and in many ways it was power. The law that protected a woman's voice, her land, and her rights could only carry her so far in a world often defined by conflict and steel. Beyond the walls of the household and the gatherings of the thing, another realm occupied the imagination and memory of Viking society, that of battle, blood, and bravery. The figure of the shieldmaiden stands at the mysterious crossroads between history and legend, between the tangible and the mythical. She is both emblem and enigma, a woman who took up arms, donned armor, and fought alongside men, defying expectations and altering the stories passed down through generations. But was she real, or simply a symbol woven into the sagas to embody something deeper about Viking ideals? The idea of the shield maiden has fascinated scholars and enthusiasts alike for centuries. Early Icelandic sagas and skaldic poetry contain references to women who fought or took part in raids. Names like Lagertha, Herva, and Brynhilda appear as warriors, leaders, or magical figures who challenged gender norms. These women wielded axes, rode horses into battle, and sometimes led men into combat. Their presence in literature was often dramatic, sometimes tragic, and occasionally imbued with supernatural qualities. They were exceptions, figures of awe, caution, and inspiration. However, the historical reality behind these stories is less clear. Archaeological evidence has been sparse and often contested. For decades, many scholars argued that she were purely literary creations, symbolic reflections of male fears, ideals, or fantasies rather than actual combatants. This skepticism arose partly from the gendered assumptions imposed on Viking culture that warfare was inherently masculine, and women's roles were confined to the domestic or ritual sphere. This view began to shift dramatically in 2017 when a grave was discovered at the Viking Age trading center of Birka in Sweden. The burial contained a skeleton initially assumed to be male due to the wealth of weapons and armor accompanying each full set of swords, axes, arrows, and shields. The grave's prestige suggested a high-status warrior. However, subsequent DNA testing revealed the skeleton was female. This groundbreaking discovery challenged long-standing assumptions and reopened debates about the existence and role of female warriors in Viking society. The Birka grave was not the only hint. Other burial sites across Scandinavia have produced weapons associated with female remains. Though identification is often complicated by preservation issues, mixed grave goods, or ambiguous skeletal analysis, some scholars caution that weapons, might have symbolic or ritual significance rather than practical use by the buried individual. Nevertheless, the Burqa find has bolstered arguments that some women did, indeed, take part in combat, whether as full-time warriors or as rare exceptions. Yet even if shield maidens existed, the question remains, how common were they? The sagas themselves often emphasize their rarity or portray them as extraordinary individuals. Some are depicted as fierce and independent, others as tragic, doomed figures whose defiance of societal norms brings downfall. Their narratives frequently highlight their marginality rather than their integration into everyday warrior culture. This ambivalence suggests that, while the idea of the female warrior held cultural power, it was not a widespread reality. Moreover, the nature of Viking warfare complicates the picture. Raiding parties were typically male-dominated, often drawn from extended kinship networks where status and strength were paramount. Combat required training, access to weapons, and social acceptance factors that could limit female participation. Yet Viking women were no strangers to violence. They defended homesteads during absences of men, managed estates in times of conflict, and in sagas sometimes led retaliations or enacted revenge. Violence was part of their lived reality, even if they rarely wielded swords openly in battle. Beyond physical combat, the figure of the shield maiden held symbolic power. She embodied the virtues of courage, loyalty, and honor, qualities central to Viking identity. These figures also served as foils to male heroes, testing their resolve, complicating gender roles, and illuminating social boundaries. Shield maidens could be portrayed as both inspiring and threatening, embodying the wildness of the North and the subversion of order. This duality was essential to their cultural significance. Archaeological contexts add further nuance. Burials with female remains might reflect different social dynamics. Some scholars suggest that high-status women could be buried with weapons as markers of prestige, leadership, or spiritual roles, rather than direct combatants. Others argue that the weapons may symbolize protective powers or connections to warrior ancestors. The ambiguity leaves room for multiple interpretations, each shedding light on how Viking society understood gender and power. Additionally, the martial roles of women may have varied regionally and temporally. The Viking Age spanned centuries and encompassed diverse communities. Coastal raiding parties might have stricter gender divisions than inland farming settlements, where women's roles in defense could have been more active. Shifts in social structure, Christianization, and increasing stratification likely influenced the visibility and acceptability of female warriors. Literary depictions also reveal the complexity of the warrior woman's place in the collective. Imagination. In the saga of the Volsungs, Brynhilda is a shield maiden of legendary prowess and tragic fate. Her story weaves together themes of love, betrayal, and vengeance, underscoring the tension between female autonomy and societal expectations. Lagertha, recounted by Saxo Grammaticus, combines the role of warrior and wife, illustrating the overlapping spheres of public power and domestic alliance. These narratives show that the shield maiden was more than a combatant. She was a symbol of contested identities. Further complicating this portrait are accounts of ritual and magic. Some sagas attribute shape-shifting or enchantment to shield maidens, suggesting their martial power might stem from supernatural forces. This blending of myth and reality reflects how Viking culture often interwove the material and spiritual. The line between a warrior and a sorceress could blur, complicating how historians interpret their existence. The notion of women warriors is not unique to Viking culture. Other ancient societies also contain stories and archaeological traces of female combatants. Comparing Viking shieldmaidens with Greek Amazon myths, Celtic female fighters, or Roman warrior women reveals shared human fascination with the concept of female power in battle. Yet Viking shieldmaidens stand out for their ambiguous positions, historic, legendary, and symbolic. Ultimately, the question of shieldmaidens invites a broader reflection on how we understand gender in the past. Were Viking women strictly confined to domestic and legal roles, or did they step onto the battlefield in defiance of norms? Did society tolerate such exceptions, or even celebrate them? Or were these stories a form of idealized fantasy that reinforced masculine identity by contrasting it with the otherness of the female warrior? The recent archaeological finds have forced a revaluation of assumptions, but also caution against overgeneralization. Shieldmaidens likely existed, but not as the norm. They were part of a complex social fabric where gender roles were flexible enough to allow for extraordinary individuals, yet structured enough to maintain broad patterns of male military dominance. In the end, the warrior woman remains both a historical possibility and a powerful symbol, shadow at the edge of Viking society's rigid hierarchies. A figure who challenges modern and medieval assumptions alike. Her presence in graveyards and saga pages alike tells us not only about weapons and warfare, but about identity, memory, and the shifting boundaries of power. Just as the image of the shieldmaiden stands at the boundary between history and legend, so too does the figure of the Volvatha Seeress, the witchwife, the woman whose power resided not in sword or shield but in prophecy, magic, and the unseen forces that wove through the Viking world. While warriors battled with steel and lawwomen commanded in the courts, the Volva operated in a realm that blended religion, mysticism, and social influence. She was a figure of deep reverence and profound fear, embodying the tension between respect for female spiritual authority and anxiety over that same power. Surtha magic practiced by these women was a complex and multifaceted form of ritual art, rooted in the manipulation of fate and the spirits. Far from the simplistic modern notion of witchcraft, seer was a sophisticated, structured practice, combining chanting, trance, ritual gestures, and the use of symbolic objects. It aimed to see the future, affect the course of events, curse enemies, or bless allies. The seeress's power was thought to reach beyond the physical world into the fabric of destiny itself. The Volva often traveled from settlement to settlement, arriving with her staffa, symbol of office, authority, and magical potency. Archaeological finds have unearthed staffs made of wood or bone, sometimes tipped with metal, indicating these were not mere walking sticks, but ritual implements. One notable example comes from a grave at Hidaby, where a woman was buried with a staff alongside objects linked to divination and ritual. Such burials suggest that these women were formally recognized and respected members of their communities, with distinct roles separate from the domestic or martial Eirik's saga Roe. One of the most detailed written sources about Seer describes the arrival of a Volva named Thorbjörg, Little Velva, to the Greenland settlement. There, the community gathers to witness her rituals, which include incantations, songs, and calls to the gods and spirits. The saga recounts her role in foretelling fate, cleansing sickness, and influencing social harmony. Her presence commands attention, and though she is a figure of awe, she is not without controversy or fear. The men of the community both respect and distance themselves from her, underscoring the liminal space these women occupied. Seer's association with women also reflected wider gender dynamics. In Norse society, it was considered a masculine shame urge for men to practice seer, as it involved elements of passive submission and potentially effeminate behavior. This stigma amplified the distinctiveness of the Vaviva's role, marking seer as a female domain of power but also an ambivalent one. The shame associated with male practitioners shows how deeply intertwined seer was with concepts of gender and social order. The Volva was not merely a mystic but often a political figure. Her prophecies could legitimize rulers, warn of dangers, or inspire action. In a world where kingship rested partly on divine favor and social acceptance, the seeress's voice carried weight. A well-timed prophecy might bolster a leader's claim or serve as a rallying cry before battle. In this way, spiritual power translated into tangible political influence. The presence of staffs and ritual objects in female graves further confirms the Vaviva's social role. In addition to staffs, finds include small pouches of herbs, carved amulets, and bones or teeth used as charms or symbols of power. These items reflect a system of knowledge that bridged healing, cursing, and divination. The Vaviva's craft was as much about practical outcomes protection from illness or harm as about metaphysical insights. But this power also attracted suspicion and fear. Christianization, which spread through Scandinavia during and after the Viking Age, portrayed practitioners of seer as agents of darkness and deceit. Many pagan practices were suppressed or condemned as witchcraft, and the vulva became a figure of demonization in later medieval sources. However, in her own cultural context, she was a respected, if sometimes uneasy presence. The liminal nature of the vulva extended to her social position. Often, she was an outsider or a wanderer, someone who moved between communities, carrying knowledge that was both valued and feared. Her independence from kinship ties allowed her to act as mediator, healer, and advisor across tribal lines. Yet it also placed her at the margins, vulnerable to suspicion or exile if her power was misunderstood. Women who acted as seeresses embodied a paradox. They wielded profound spiritual authority, but were sometimes treated as socially suspect or dangerous. Their knowledge placed them above ordinary mortals, but also outside conventional roles. This duality echoes in saga literature, where vulvas are portrayed both as wise and prophetic, and as witches whose curses could bring ruin. The power of the vulva was expressed through oral poetry and ritual drama. The chants and songs used in seer often invoked gods, ancestors, and spirits, and their words were believed to carry real force. This performative aspect linked the seeress to the tradition of skaldic poetry, itself a form of magical speech. The Vaviva's voice was a weapon and a shield, a means to navigate the unseen forces that governed fate. Seer rituals also involved trance states, induced through chanting, drumming, or other methods, allowing the vulva to enter altered states of consciousness. In these moments, she was believed to journey to other worlds, communicate with spirits, or glimpse future events. Such journeys were dangerous, both physically and spiritually, and required skill and courage. The ritual was not passive, but demanding, a testament to the Vaviva's strength. The cultural importance of seer can be further understood through comparisons to other Indo-European traditions of female shamans or wise women. Like the Greek Sibyl or the Celtic Druids, the Norse seeress combined healing, prophecy, and ritual leadership. These roles were often the preserve of women, whose perceived connection to nature and the spirit world gave them authority. Sia was also intimately connected to the cycles of life and death. The vulva could aid in childbirth, heal illness, or prepare the dead for their journey. Her knowledge of herbs, charms, and spiritual practices made her a vital figure in maintaining the health and harmony of her community. This role extended beyond the individual, reinforcing social cohesion through ritual. Yet with this power came danger. The fear that a vulva could curse or harm was very real, and accusations of witchcraft were a means to control or exclude those who threatened. Social norms. In some cases, women practicing Sia might be accused of causing storms, plagues, or misfortune. These tensions underscore how spiritual power was both a gift and a source of vulnerability. Grave finds further illuminate this ambiguity. Some vulva burials show signs of deliberate exclusion or isolation, suggesting that while honored in life, these women were feared in death. Their resting places may have been set apart or marked with symbols warning others. Such treatment echoes later European witchcraft persecutions, but reflects a specifically Norse negotiation of power and danger. In saga literature, the Viva's words often come as warnings or riddles, cryptic messages that require interpretation. This reflects the ambivalence of Sia itself, a source of knowledge that is never fully controllable. The vulva is a keeper of mysteries, a mediator between the known and the unknown. This mystical role offers a different lens on Viking women's power, where shieldmaidens wielded swords and matriarchs managed households. The vulva wielded words and symbols. Her influence was subtle but profound, shaping decisions and destinies from behind veils of chant and smoke. Together, these figures, matron, seeress, compose a multifaceted image of Viking women's power. It was neither singular nor static, but woven from diverse threads of strength, wisdom, and agency. The vulva reminds us that power in Viking society was not only measured in arms or land, but also in the capacity to glimpse and influence the invisible forces that shaped life itself. From the ethereal power of the vulva and the enigmatic figure of the shieldmaiden, the thread of Viking women's agency leads naturally into the complex and often violent world of clan politics, where survival depended not only on strength, but on diplomacy, negotiation, and the delicate art of alliance building. In a society where blood feuds could erupt with devastating consequences, women played critical and often underappreciated roles as peace weavers, defenders, and political agents, figures whose influence could turn the tide between war and reconciliation. The Scandinavian world of the Viking Age was intensely kin-based. Loyalties, honor, and vengeance flowed along bloodlines, with family ties shaping every interaction. When disputes arose over land, honor, or insults, they often escalated into feuds, cycles of retaliation that could last generations. These feuds were not chaotic outbursts, but followed a complex code of conduct and legal expectations. Yet, within this framework, women held important responsibilities that could shape outcomes as decisively as any sword. One of the most dramatic and best-known sources illustrating these dynamics is Ungela's saga, a cornerstone of Icelandic literature that intricately portrays the tensions of honor, vengeance, and reconciliation. The saga centers on Ungel, a wise and respected chieftain, and the deadly conflicts that engulf his family and community. Women within this narrative are not passive victims, but active players, shaping events through speech, alliances, and acts of courage. Peace weaving, or fredsving, was a vital role often taken on by women. They acted as mediators and negotiators between hostile families, arranging marriages or settlements that could halt bloodshed. Such marriages were political tools, binding clans together through new kinship ties and obligations. The bride was often a diplomat in her own right, tasked with creating bonds of loyalty and easing tensions in a new household. The importance of these marital alliances cannot be overstated. Marriages were strategic contracts as much as personal unions. Women entering hostile families brought with them the power to influence negotiations, temper conflicts, and preserve fragile truces. Their presence at the intersection of two clans made them vital conduits of communication and trust. Through their diplomacy, women could prevent feuds from escalating or help bring them to an end. Fosterage, another key institution, further expanded women's political and diplomatic reach. Viking society commonly practiced the fostering of children, sending them to be raised in another household, often that of allies or friends. This created deep social bonds extending beyond immediate kinship, weaving a web of loyalty and mutual obligation. Women, particularly foster mothers, played central roles in nurturing and shaping these bonds. The foster mother was responsible not only for the child's upbringing, but for ensuring that the ties between families remained strong. In many sagas, the relationship between foster mother and foster child is depicted as deeply emotional and influential, often paralleling or even surpassing biological bonds. This relationship created personal loyalties that could diffuse potential conflicts or foster cooperation. Such ties could serve as informal diplomacy, connecting families across regions and clans. A well-placed foster mother could mediate disputes by invoking the shared history and affection developed through. These bonds often underpinned political alliances, providing networks of support that were less formal but no less effective than treaties. Women's roles as defenders extended beyond negotiation. In times of violence or siege, they often took responsibility for protecting homesteads, managing resources, and rallying household members. Saga literature offers numerous accounts of women who confronted attackers, organized defenses, or even wielded weapons to defend their kin. These acts were extensions of their roles as household heads and bearers of honor. The defense of family honor was central to the Viking code. Honor was a collective attribute tied to the reputation of the clan and lineage. Women were its guardians, expected to uphold and protect the family name. Insults or injuries to a woman's reputation could provoke retaliation just as fiercely as attacks on men. This made women both symbols and agents of familial power. Negotiation in this charged atmosphere demanded skill, courage, and political savvy. Women often spoke at assemblies or private meetings, using persuasion, social standing, and knowledge of law to shape outcomes. Their words could diffuse tensions or, when necessary, justify vengeance. This verbal power was a form of defense, an extension of their role as protectors. The saga of Ungels also reveals the darker side of these conflicts. Despite women's efforts, feuds sometimes spiraled beyond control, fueled by pride, revenge, and tragic miscalculations. Women themselves could be caught in these cycles, targeted in retaliation or used as pawns in political schemes. Yet even then, their resilience and agency remained evident. A famous example from Ungel's saga is Halgura H. Skjoldstotter, whose sharp tongue and strong will both inflamed and negotiated conflicts. Her character embodies the complex intersection of female power and social expectations simultaneously feared, respected, and pivotal. Through her actions, the saga portrays the profound impact women could have in the volatile world of Viking politics. Fosterage's importance is further highlighted by the roles played by foster children once grown. These individuals often acted as emissaries or warriors loyal to their foster families, strengthening alliances forged in childhood. Women's role in nurturing these bonds ensured that political loyalties extended beyond birthright, blending affection and obligation that the intertwined systems of marriage and fosterage thus created networks of diplomacy essential to Viking societies. Survival. Women operated within these systems not as passive actors, but as active, skilled negotiators and defenders. Their influence helped manage the delicate balance between war and peace, revenge and reconciliation, while male chieftains and warriors often take center stage in historical and literary accounts. It is clear that Viking women's diplomatic labor was foundational. Without their mediation, many feuds might have escalated into endless bloodshed, fracturing communities. Their roles as peace weavers demonstrate how power in Viking culture was multifaceted, exercised in speech and relationship as much as in battle. This duality of diplomacy and defense reflects a broader theme in Viking women's lives, their simultaneous positioning at the heart of both conflict and resolution. Their actions were not limited to passive endurance, but included proactive measures to shape the fate of their families and clans. Moreover, the legal rights women held, described earlier, reinforced their ability to act in these roles. Their status as property holders, legal witnesses, and heads of households gave them the formal authority to negotiate, defend, and represent family interests. These rights were not abstract, but practical tools in the fraught arena of clan politics. The saga literature provides numerous examples where women's diplomatic interventions altered the course of history, whether through marriage alliances, fostering relationships, or direct negotiation. Their involvement was essential. These stories underscore the recognition within Viking culture of women as bearers of social cohesion and political stability, the intertwining of personal and political in these roles also reveals much about Viking notions of kinship and power. Women's bodies, words, and relationships were sites of influence, capable of shaping alliances and fueling or quelling feuds. Their agency was exercised through networks of kinship rather than isolated individual power, reflecting the collective nature of Viking society. In this context, the concept of honor and vengeance takes on complex dimensions. Women were not simply objects of dispute, but active participants in enforcing and negotiating these codes. Their capacity to initiate divorce, claim property, or testify in court gave them leverage in conflicts that might otherwise be exclusively male domains. Fosterage extended this influence by creating chosen kin beyond blood ties, a powerful political tool. Women's role in managing these relationships added layers of social security, enabling alliances that crossed geographic and familial boundaries. This flexibility was crucial in a world where survival depended on the ability to adapt to shifting alliances. Thus, through marriage, fosterage, and negotiation, Viking women emerged as indispensable diplomats and defenders. Their influence was woven into the fabric of clan politics and social order. They acted not from weakness, but from a position of recognized authority and strategic insight. This broader understanding challenges simplified narratives of Viking women as either passive, victims, or mere domestic figures. Instead, it reveals a society in which women held multifaceted roles, combining strength, diplomacy, legal acumen, and courage that shaped the very nature of Viking social and political life, the intricate dance of diplomacy and defense practiced by Viking women within the confines of clan and settlement was only one dimension of their complex lives. As the reach of the Vikings extended far beyond the fjords and forests of Scandinavia, so too did the roles of women. Those who ventured across seas, carved out new homes in unfamiliar lands, and engaged in trade, settlement, and cultural exchange. Viking women were not merely passive observers of expansion. They were travelers, traders, and settlers who actively shaped the contours of a rapidly changing world. The Viking Age, roughly spanning from the late 8th to the early 11th century, was marked by dramatic movement, raids on distant shores, the establishment of trade routes, and the founding of colonies. These expansions were predominantly associated with men's exploits. Yet the archaeological record and historical accounts reveal that women often accompanied these journeys or followed soon after, integral to the foundation and sustenance of new communities. Iceland, one of the most famous Viking settlements outside Scandinavia, exemplifies the essential role women played in colonization. According to Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, Iceland's first settlers arrived in the late 9th century, a mix of chieftains, farmers, and families. The women who came with them brought more than just their physical presence. They carried seeds of culture, law, language, and social structure. Their labor in building homes, cultivating land, and maintaining the household was foundational in transforming a wild volcanic landscape into a thriving society. Women in Iceland were active agents in community formation. They preserved oral traditions, maintained social networks, and passed on customs vital to the fledgling society's cohesion. The sagas that emerged from Iceland centuries later often highlight women's involvement in family disputes, land ownership, and legal proceedings, illustrating a society where female voices resonated clearly in public life. Farther east, Viking women's journeys extended into the realms of the Rus, the Norse-influenced territories along the rivers of modern Russia and Ukraine. The Varangians, Norse traders and warriors, established themselves as rulers and merchants along the Dnieper and Volga rivers, linking the Baltic to the Byzantine Empire and the Arab world. Women followed these routes, settling in towns and integrating into local societies. Archaeological finds in the ancient city of Staria Ladoga and Novgorod include female graves with Scandinavian jewelry and artifacts, indicating Norse women's presence in these eastern outposts. These women often acted as cultural bridges, maintaining Norse customs while adapting to Slavic environments. Their marriages with local men forged alliances and facilitated trade, spreading Viking influence in subtle but lasting ways. Trade was a vital aspect of Viking expansion, and women's involvement in commerce was significant. Textile production, as discussed earlier, was a key economic activity often overseen by women. The textiles they created were not only used domestically, but became important trade goods, exchanged for silver, spices, and luxury items. Women also likely managed household-level trade and barter, negotiating deals and maintaining relationships with traveling merchants. The bustling trade centers of Birka, Hidaby, and Rib bore witness to women's commercial roles. Marketplaces were spaces where women gathered, sold goods, and exchanged news, while men controlled larger-scale trading ventures. Women's participation in local commerce helped sustain these economic hubs. Their ability to navigate both the material and social aspects of trade further underlines their multifaceted contributions. The Viking expansions into the West present some of the most dramatic examples of women's roles in settlement and cultural transplantation. Greenland, colonized around 985 CE by Eric the Red, became a harsh but viable new home. Women who accompanied settlers faced extreme conditions, bitter cold, limited resources, and isolation. Their resilience was crucial in establishing farms, raising children, and maintaining social order in this frontier. The archaeological record from Greenland includes female graves adorned with jewelry and tools, suggesting that women maintained cultural traditions even in this remote outpost. Their knowledge of animal husbandry, food preparation, and domestic management ensured the survival of the community amid challenging circumstances. Even further west lay Vinland, the mysterious North American land glimpsed by Norse explorers. Though the settlement at Lonso Meadows was short-lived, it provides the earliest evidence of European presence in the Americas. While direct evidence of Viking women in Vinland remains limited, Norse sagas mention family groups traveling together, indicating that women likely participated in these ventures. Women's presence in such expansions was not simply practical, but symbolic. They represented continuity and rootedness, the establishment of homes and futures beyond raids and conquests. Their roles helped shift Viking activity from episodic raids to sustained colonization, transforming transient incursions into lasting societies. In the British Isles, Viking women played prominent roles as well. The Danawa, the Norse-controlled region of England established in the 9th and 10th centuries, was a melting pot of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon cultures. Women living in this area bore names from both traditions and participated in cultural exchange, marriage alliances, and economic activity. Evidence from burial sites in York and other Danelaw centres shows that women were buried with distinctive jewelry, often combining Norse and Anglo-Saxon motifs. This blending reflects their dual identities and the cultural fusion occurring in these frontier zones. Women acted as cultural mediators, preserving Norse heritage while integrating with local populations. Trade in the Danelaw included not only goods, but ideas and customs. Women likely played a central role in this transmission, maintaining oral traditions, crafting textiles, and participating in local markets. Their presence helped sustain Norse cultural identity, even as assimilation progressed. Farther afield, Viking women's influence touched the Byzantine Empire. The Varangians served as elite mercenaries in Constantinople, and it is plausible that women traveled with or joined these groups. Byzantine sources hint at Norse women in the capital, though direct evidence remains scant. Nevertheless, their presence in such cosmopolitan centers speaks to the broad reach of Viking networks. The travels of Viking women were both physical and cultural journeys. They navigated unfamiliar landscapes, languages, and social systems, carrying with them traditions that adapted and evolved. Their experiences underscore that Viking expansion was not merely a story of conquest, but of migration, settlement, and cultural synthesis. In these new worlds, women's roles continued to encompass domestic management, economic activity, and social leadership. They negotiated identities in hybrid communities, balancing Norse customs with local influences. Their adaptability ensured the survival and flourishing of Viking descendants far from the northern homelands. This mobility also impacted Viking women's social status. Those who ventured beyond Scandinavia often gained new opportunities and responsibilities in frontier societies where survival depended on cooperation and resourcefulness. Women's labor and leadership were highly valued. The necessity of managing households in harsh conditions could elevate their authority within families and communities. Travel and settlement also brought challenges. Women faced dangers on voyages, from storms at sea to hostile encounters on land. The risks of childbirth and disease were magnified in unfamiliar territories. Yet their willingness to undertake such journeys reflects courage and determination. The legacy of these Viking women travelers extends beyond their immediate historical moment. Their stories remind us that Viking expansion was a human enterprise, involving families, relationships, and daily life as much as battles and politics. Women's roles in these movements were essential threads woven into the broader tapestry of Viking history. As the Viking world expanded and evolved, so did the identities and possibilities for women. They were not mere bystanders, but active participants in shaping new communities, influencing trade, and sustaining cultural memory across continents. Their journeys beyond the north were journeys of resilience, adaptation, and transformation, as Viking women ventured across seas, forging new lives far from their northern homelands. The spiritual world that surrounded them remained a vital and evolving presence. The rhythms of belief shaped their daily existence, from the household rituals of offering to gods and ancestors to the profound transformations wrought by the arrival of Christianity. Faith, both pagan and Christian, was not merely a backdrop, but a living force that structured women's roles, their sense of identity, and the communities they nurtured. Before the cross, the Norse pagan faith centered on a pantheon of gods and goddesses whose stories permeated the fabric of Viking life. Among these deities, Freya held a special place in the spiritual and social landscape for women. As a goddess of love, fertility, war, and death, Freya embodied the complex roles women inhabited. She was invoked in rites of childbirth, marriage, and battle, representing both creation and destruction. Rituals dedicated to Freya and other deities often took place within the home, underscoring women's central role as custodians of spiritual life. Domestic offerings, small gifts of food, drink, or crafted items were common, serving as acts of reverence and requests for protection or favor. Archaeological excavations of Viking homes reveal small altars or dedicated spaces where such offerings might have been placed, highlighting how belief was woven into the everyday. Women performed these rites not only for themselves, but for the well-being of their families and communities. The act of offering was both personal and communal, a means to negotiate with forces beyond human control and to maintain harmony between the mortal and divine worlds. The repeated cycles of birth, death, and seasonal change found expression through these ceremonies, linking the household to cosmic order. Burial customs further illustrate the spiritual dimensions of Viking women's lives. Pagan graves often contained goods meant to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. Jewelry, tools, weapons, and sometimes food or drink. Women's graves provide rich evidence of these practices, with items reflecting status, profession, and spiritual belief. The ship burial of a high-status woman in Oseberg, Norway, is one of the most iconic examples. The burial mound enclosed an elaborately decorated ship filled with furnishings, textiles, and grave goods. This dramatic interment signified not only the woman's earthly importance, but her passage into the afterlife, accompanied by symbols of wealth and power. Such burials underscore the profound connection between faith and social standing. Spiritual authority was not confined to men. Women sometimes acted as priestesses or ritual specialists, performing ceremonies and maintaining Sacred knowledge, the vulva, discussed earlier, was one such figure, blending magic and religion. Their rituals bridged the material and spiritual, influencing community, well-being, and fate. However, the Norse pagan faith was not static. By the late Viking Age, Christianity began to spread across Scandinavia and Viking-controlled territories, bringing new beliefs, practices, and social structures. The arrival of the cross introduced profound changes to women's lives. Some freedoms were curtailed, while new roles and opportunities emerged. Christian conversion often came gradually and unevenly. In some areas, such as Iceland, conversion was legally mandated in the early 11th century, blending traditional practices with Christian beliefs. In others, the process took centuries, with syncretic rituals persisting alongside Christian worship. This religious transition was not merely theological but social and political, reshaping kinship, law, and gender roles. One significant change concerned women's legal and social status. Christianity's emphasis on patriarchal authority and the sanctity of marriage redefined women's roles within family and society. The ability to initiate divorce, which had existed under pagan law, was restricted. Women's sexuality and behavior became more tightly regulated, reflecting broader Christian norms. Yet Christianity also provided new avenues for female agency, particularly through monastic life. Convents and nunneries offered women spaces for education, leadership, and spiritual authority. Women could become abbesses, managing property and influencing religious and social affairs. This role was a marked departure from earlier pagan structures, introducing institutionalized female religious leadership. Christian burial practices also transformed rites of death. Grave goods declined sharply, replaced by simple inhumations oriented toward the east, symbolizing resurrection and the afterlife in Christian belief. Women's graves from this period reflect these changes, with fewer material possessions but often marked by crosses or other Christian symbols. Despite the shift, many elements of earlier beliefs persisted in folk customs and popular practices. The blending of pagan and Christian elements created a layered spiritual landscape where women navigated multiple traditions. For instance, offerings to local spirits or saints sometimes continued alongside church attendance. This syncretism highlights women's role as cultural mediators, preserving ancestral practices even as they embraced new faiths. Their participation in rituals, festivals, and daily worship sustained community cohesion. During times of upheaval, the impact of Christianity extended beyond Scandinavia to Viking settlements abroad. In the British Isles, Greenland, and Eastern Europe, conversion intertwined with political alliances and cultural exchange. Viking women in these regions often adapted to Christian customs while maintaining Norse identity, embodying the fluidity of religious and cultural boundaries. In England's, for example, Christian baptism and marriage rites gradually replaced Norse practices, altering family structures and inheritance laws. Women's roles shifted accordingly, with increased emphasis on Christian virtues and piety. Yet, archaeological finds reveal continuities in dress and ornamentation, suggesting ongoing negotiation of identity. Similarly, in Iceland, Christian laws modified previous customs but retained distinctive local features. Women continued to exercise legal rights and maintain social influence, navigating the changing religious landscape with pragmatism and resilience. The transition from paganism to Christianity was not a simple replacement, but a complex transformation. Women's faith was both a personal and political matter, reflecting broader shifts in power, identity, and community. Through it all, faith remained a cornerstone of Viking women's lives, source of comfort, authority, and connection. Whether invoking Freya's blessings, honoring ancestors, or embracing the Christian cross, their spirituality shaped the rhythm of birth and death, joy and sorrow, conflict and reconciliation. As Viking society evolved, women's religious roles adapted, blending tradition and innovation. Their faith journeys revealed the dynamic interplay between belief and culture, illustrating how spirituality was woven into the very fabric of their existence. This layered religious identity in ancient gods and transformed by Christian doctrine offers profound insight into Viking women's worlds. It underscores their resilience, agency, and capacity to navigate change while preserving core values. The spiritual journeys and shifting religious identities of Viking women find their most tangible expression in the silent language of graves. Across Scandinavia and Viking settlements abroad, burial sites provide a window into lives lived centuries ago. Lives of women whose stories echo through the artifacts placed with them and the care of their resting places. These silent witnesses reveal the interplay of status, belief, and societal values that shaped Viking culture, especially as they pertain to women. Burial customs in Viking society were diverse, reflecting regional traditions, personal status, and evolving religious beliefs. From the grand ship burials to modest cremations, the graves reveal a spectrum of social hierarchies and gendered roles that persisted even beyond death. By analyzing these graves, archaeologists and historians piece together narratives that written sources alone cannot fully capture. Among the most famous and richly furnished female burials is the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, dated to the early 9th century. Here, 2 women were interred in a large, ornately carved wooden ship, accompanied by an astonishing array of grave goods, textiles, tools, household items, and personal ornaments. The scale and richness of this burial suggest the women were of extremely high status, possibly of noble birth or possessing significant religious or political authority. The Oseberg burial highlights several key aspects of Viking female identity. The presence of textile tools and finely woven fabrics points to women's roles as producers of valuable goods and keepers of domestic wealth. The lavish nature of the grave goods also speaks to the importance of social status and the desire to project power even in death. These women were not anonymous. Their burial was a statement of their place within society. Contrasting with such opulence are numerous simpler graves, often containing fewer goods, but still marked by care and ritual. These modest burials belonged to women of lower social rank, yet their presence in cemeteries and the inclusion of personal items indicate the universality of death, rituals, and the significance of memory. The variance in grave wealth reflects a gendered hierarchy that extended into the afterlife. While men might be buried with weapons and armor, emphasizing martial prowess, women's graves often contained jewelry, textiles, and tools associated with domestic or spiritual roles. This division underlines how societal values shaped not only life but also death. However, even within these patterns, exceptions emerge. Some women's graves include weapons or symbols of leadership, suggesting that female status was not monolithic and that women could occupy diverse roles, warriors, priestesses, or matriarchs. Such graves challenge simplistic interpretations of Viking gender roles, revealing a complex social fabric. Grave goods also serve as indicators of cultural identity, In Viking settlements abroad, burial customs combine Norse traditions with local influences. For example, in the British Isles, Scandinavian female graves often incorporate Anglo-Saxon artifacts, reflecting a blending of cultures. These hybrid burials illustrate how Viking women adapted and preserved identity within new environments. The placement and orientation of graves further illuminate religious beliefs and social structures. Pagan graves were often aligned according to cosmological principles, reflecting views of the afterlife and the journey of the soul. The careful arrangement of objects around the body suggests ritual practices aimed at ensuring safe passage to the next world. Ship burials, such as those at Oseberg and elsewhere, symbolized a voyage beyond death, linking the deceased to the sea that shaped Viking life. The ship was a potent metaphor for transition and transformation, embodying both status and spiritual belief. Women interred in such burials were accorded honors that transcended earthly life, affirming their significance within the community. Beyond physical artifacts, inscriptions and runes, occasionally found on grave markers, provide glimpses into memory and commemoration. These texts, though rare, sometimes mention the deceased's name, lineage, or virtues, preserving identity in stone or wood. Such inscriptions reveal the importance placed on remembrance and honor, especially for women of standing. The social function of burial rituals extended to the living community. Funerals were occasions for reaffirming kinship ties, settling disputes, and demonstrating social cohesion. Women played roles in these ceremonies, both as mourners and ritual specialists, perpetuating traditions that linked past and present. Analysis of skeletal remains also sheds light on women's health, diet, and life experiences. Studies reveal patterns of wear on bones that correspond to labor-intensive activities, such as textile production or farming, confirming historical accounts of women's daily work. Evidence of injuries or illnesses adds a human dimension, reflecting the physical challenges women faced. Mortality rates, especially related to childbirth, are visible in burial patterns. Some graves contain mother and infant interred together, poignantly underscoring the mortal risks women bore in bringing forth new life. These burials evoke the fragility and resilience intertwined in the cycle of life and death. The shift from pagan to Christian burial customs is evident in the archaeological record, marking a profound transformation in spiritual outlook and social organization. Christian graves became simpler, oriented east-west, and largely devoid of grave goods, reflecting new beliefs about the afterlife and the soul's journey. Women's graves from this transitional period demonstrate how cultural and religious shifts affected gendered expressions of memory. The decline in material offerings did not diminish the importance of commemoration, but changed its form, focusing more on spiritual salvation than earthly status. In many cases, the continuity of burial sites across generations indicates respect for ancestors and the maintenance of familial heritage. Women's graves formed part of these ancestral landscapes, anchoring communities to place and history. This connection between memory and identity underscores the enduring influence of women within Viking society. The study of graves also reveals social tensions and contradictions. Some burial sites show evidence of exclusion or marginalization, with certain women buried separately or with fewer goods. These patterns may reflect social conflicts, accusations of witchcraft, or other forms of stigma, highlighting the complex social dynamics surrounding death. Comparative analysis between regions illustrates variations in gender roles and status. For instance, in some areas, women's graves are richly furnished, while in others, male burials dominate the archaeological record. These differences point to local customs, economic conditions, and cultural values. The interpretation of Viking graves is an ongoing process, combining archaeological methods with historical texts, forensic science, and anthropological theory. Each discovery adds nuance to our understanding of women's lives and deaths, revealing a society where gender and status shaped experience from cradle to grave. In essence, the graves of Viking women speak across time, telling stories of power, faith, labor, and identity. They bear witness to a world where women's contributions were vital and complex, encompassing the domestic, spiritual, and political spheres. By examining these silent witnesses, we glimpse the full tapestry of Viking life culture that revered its dead, honored its women, and wove memory into the very soil beneath its feet. As the stones of Viking burial mounds stand silent, the voices of women echo vividly through the saga literature, a rich corpus blending history, legend, and social commentary. These narratives, passed down through generations, both reflect and shape Viking ideals of womanhood, honor, and vengeance. The sagas offer complex portraits of female figures whose lives, whether historical or fictionalized, illuminate the multifaceted roles women occupied in Norse society. Among the most compelling saga heroines is Rune, Asvith Astota, a woman whose story unfolds with the depth and intensity of a tragic epic. Featured in Laxdela Saga, Rune's life is marked by love, betrayal, and relentless determination. She embodies the tensions of Viking womanhood, caught between personal desire and social expectation, loyalty and vengeance. Rune's narrative traverses marriages to powerful men, the loss of children, and political turmoil. Her intelligence and resolve enable her to navigate these challenges, asserting influence in a male-dominated world. Far from a passive figure, she takes active roles in shaping events, seeking justice for wrongs done to her family. Her story reflects key cultural values: honor, kinship, loyalty, and the pursuit of vengeance when necessary. Rune's calculated actions demonstrate how women could wield subtle power, manipulating social networks and family alliances to protect their interests and assert agency. Her complexity resists simplistic characterization, portraying a woman who is both vulnerable and formidable. Another seminal figure is Orda Djp, Gar or Ord, the deep-minded, a historical and legendary woman celebrated for her wisdom and pioneering spirit. Chronicled in Laxdela Saga and other sources, Ord stands as a symbol of female leadership and resilience. Ord was among the first to lead a group of settlers to Iceland, overseeing the establishment of new communities. Her story highlights women's roles as colonizers and organizers, extending influence beyond the domestic sphere into political and economic realms. As a widow, she inherited property and power, defying contemporary gender norms. Her legacy is one of pragmatic leadership combined with deep piety and cultural stewardship. Ord's ability to command, respect, and maintain social order in a turbulent frontier context underscores the possibilities open to Viking women under certain conditions. Her saga resonates with themes of survival, faith, and the transmission of cultural identity. Halgaru Langbrock, famously portrayed in Engjal Saga, offers a contrasting yet equally rich exploration of womanhood. known for her beauty and sharp tongue. Halgara's character is complex, both admired and feared for her influence over men and events. Her assertiveness and occasional cruelty make her a controversial figure, often blamed for stirring conflict and tragedy. Yet Halgara's narrative also reveals the constraints and pressures faced by women, whose social standing depended heavily on marriage and familial alliances. Her story is entwined with themes of pride, honor, and the volatile nature of power. Halgara exemplifies how saga literature grapples with female agency, portraying women who navigate limited options through strength, manipulation, or vengeance. Her legacy provokes questions about the roles women could play in Viking society and the consequences of defying expectations. These saga figures are not isolated, but exist within a broader tapestry of women portrayed across Norse literature. The sagas often feature women as key actors in family dramas, political disputes, and supernatural encounters. Their words and deeds influence outcomes as decisively as those of men. The sagas also serve as social mirrors, reflecting contemporary attitudes toward gender roles and societal values. Women's honor was intimately tied to family reputation, chastity, and loyalty, yet they could wield power through marriage, motherhood, and cunning. The sagas acknowledge this duality, showing women as both vulnerable and empowered. Honor, a central theme, governed much of saga behavior. Women were bearers of family honor and could provoke or prevent feuds. Their ability to invoke or defy social norms made them pivotal figures in maintaining or disrupting social order. Saga narratives highlight moments where women's actions either restored peace or fueled vengeance. Vengeance, another driving force, was often pursued through female agency. Women might orchestrate revenge, use speech to shame enemies, or manipulate alliances. These acts reflect a culture where social equilibrium depended on retribution and reconciliation, and women were active participants in this balance. The sagas also revealed the importance of memory and storytelling in shaping identity. Female figures were remembered not only for their deeds, but for how their stories were told, imbued with moral lessons, cultural ideals, or cautionary warnings. This narrative construction influenced how society perceived womanhood and power. Moreover, saga literature blends historical fact with myth and symbolism. Some women, like Ord, are rooted in historical events, while others, like Halgara, occupy a more legendary space. This interplay creates a layered understanding of Viking women, where individual experiences resonate with collective cultural meaning. The depiction of women in the sagas also intersects with spirituality. Female characters often engage with the supernatural, consulting seers, performing rituals, or encountering otherworldly beings. This spiritual dimension adds depth to their roles. Linking the mortal and divine. Saga women sometimes embody archetypes: the loyal wife, the cunning matriarch, the tragic heroine. These roles are portrayed with nuance. Their stories explore the limits and possibilities of female power within a patriarchal society, highlighting both resistance and conformity. The literary treatment of women in the sagas has influenced modern perceptions of Viking culture. Popular images of shieldmaidens, wise women, or vengeful wives owe much to these narratives, even as scholarship seeks to differentiate myth from reality. The sagas remain a vital source for understanding the ideals and complexities of Viking womanhood. In conclusion, the saga literature offers a rich repository of female voices that echo across centuries. Through the lives of Gudrun, Ard, Halga, Yor, and others, we glimpse the diverse ways Viking women navigated honor, power, and identity. Their stories, woven into the social fabric, reflect a culture that acknowledged women's central roles in both memory and action. These narratives do not simply recount events, but engage with deeper questions of gender, society, and morality. They provide a dynamic portrait of women as agents shaping history, preserving culture, and challenging the boundaries of their world. The saga's vivid portrayals of Viking women, with their blend of power, agency, and complexity, stand as a testament to a particular cultural moment or world where women navigated honor and vengeance with notable freedom and influence. Yet, as the Viking Age drew to a close, profound transformations began to reshape Scandinavian society. The gradual Christianization and political centralization of the region ushered in changes that significantly curtailed the legal and cultural autonomy that Viking women had once enjoyed. This transition marked the slow erosion of the old ways, heralding the decline of the longhouse as a locus of female power and the rise of more rigid patriarchal structures. The shift did not happen overnight. Rather, it was a protracted and uneven process, unfolding over the course of centuries. As kings consolidated authority, churches expanded their influence, and new laws codified changing social norms. Yet these changes had profound consequences, fundamentally altering women's roles within family, society, and faith. One of the most significant drivers of this transformation was the increasing influence of Christian doctrine and ecclesiastical authority. As Christianity spread across Scandinavia from the 10th century onward, it brought with it a distinct set of moral codes, social expectations, and legal frameworks. These often clashed with the older Norse customs that had granted women a surprising degree of legal agency and social respect. Under Viking pagan law, women could inherit property, divorce, represent themselves in court, and wield considerable control over their households. However, Christian law emphasized patriarchal authority and monogamous marriage as spiritual ideals, restricting women's freedoms accordingly. The Church's insistence on marriage as a sacrament transformed family relations, diminishing women's ability to negotiate divorce or assert independence. This process was mirrored in the secular, legal reforms that accompanied the centralization of Scandinavian kingdoms. Kings seeking to impose order and unify their realms enacted laws reflecting Christian values and monarchical control. These reforms often curtailed women's property rights and their capacity to act autonomously in legal matters. For example, in Norway and Iceland, earlier laws that allowed women to manage estates or initiate divorce were replaced or overridden by statutes emphasizing male guardianship and marital fidelity. Women's legal testimony, once a recognized part of Viking courts, became less influential or was subject to ecclesiastical oversight. The enforcement of monogamy was another crucial change. Polygamy and concubinage, which had been tolerated under pagan norms, were increasingly condemned by the Church. This redefinition of marital structures confined women within stricter roles as wives and mothers, reducing their social flexibility. That the growing power of the Church also meant that women's religious roles transformed. While some women embraced monastic life and gained spiritual authority as abbesses, the broad spiritual autonomy enjoyed by figures like the vulva was suppressed. Magic and pagan rituals were condemned as heresy or witchcraft, marginalizing traditional female spiritual practitioners. This religious and legal restructuring dovetailed with political centralization, as kings and chieftains asserted control over their domains. the autonomous longhouse, the family-centered seat of power, gave way to larger political entities with hierarchical administration. This shift weakened the matriarchal authority, symbolized by the husfrok, the woman of the household who once held the keys to both physical and symbolic wealth. In this new order, women's power was often mediated through their relationships with men, fathers, husbands, or church officials rather than exercised independently. The intimate but decentralized Viking family network was replaced by a more rigid, top-down social hierarchy. The cultural impact of these changes extended beyond law and religion into daily life and social expectations, literature and folklore. From the later medieval period reflect altered attitudes toward women's roles, emphasizing obedience, chastity, and domesticity over the boldness and negotiation seen in earlier sagas. Women's dress and behavior were increasingly policed by church and state, with moralizing texts condemning female sexuality and asserting male dominance. These cultural norms reinforced the legal restrictions, embedding patriarchal values deeply within Scandinavian society. Despite this decline in formal autonomy, Viking women did not disappear into passivity. Many continued to exercise influence within the constraints imposed upon them, managing estates, arranging alliances, and participating in local governance where possible. The endurance of folk customs and the persistence of women's networks suggest a complex negotiation between old and new values. Furthermore, monastic communities provided alternative spheres of power for some women. Nunneries became centers of learning, charity, and spiritual leadership, offering paths to authority not available in secular society. These institutions allowed women to cultivate intellectual and religious agency, though often within hierarchical, ecclesiastical frameworks. The transformation also impacted inheritance and succession patterns. The emphasis on male primogeniture reduced women's claims to land and titles, concentrating wealth and power in male hands. This shift altered family dynamics and reshaped the distribution of resources. This legal and cultural reordering was not unique to Scandinavia but part of broader European trends. However, its impact on Viking women was particularly acute given their previous legal status and social roles. The loss of freedoms they had enjoyed under Norse law represents a significant rupture in gender relations. The fall of the Longhouse, therefore, symbolizes more than the decline of a physical structure it marks. The erosion of a cultural model that had allowed women substantial autonomy and authority. The consolidation of kingdom and church imposed new frameworks that marginalized women's independent power. Yet, within this narrative of loss, traces of Viking women's resilience remain. Stories, customs, and occasional legal provisions reveal ongoing struggles to maintain influence and navigate changing realities. The complexity of this transition reflects the tensions inherent in social change. In the end, the transition from Viking autonomy to medieval patriarchy was a layered and contested process, shaped by religious zeal, political ambition, and cultural negotiation. Women's experiences during this period illuminate how gender and power intersect in moments of historical transformation. Their journey from the respected husfrok, holding the household keys, to the constrained medieval matron reveals both the fragility and persistence of female agency. Though diminished in formal rites, Viking women's legacies continued in traditions, memories, and the subtle forms of power they retained. This chapter closes the long saga of Viking women's autonomy, offering a poignant reflection on how sweeping historical forces reshape lives and cultures. It invites us to consider the interplay of faith, law, and social structure in defining the boundaries of gender and authority. The stories of Viking women, forged in the crucible of a distant age, have echoed through the centuries with a resonance that is at once captivating and complex. Their lives, once lived in the rugged landscapes of Scandinavia and its far-flung settlements, have become subjects of myth, distortion, and rediscovery. As the Viking Age recedes further into history, the legacy of these women remains vivid, but often obscured by layers of cultural reinterpretation and modern imagination. Understanding this legacy requires navigating between myth and reality, recognizing both the cultural significance and the misconceptions that have shaped how Viking women are remembered. During the 19th century, as nationalism swept across Europe, the image of the Viking became a potent symbol of cultural pride and identity. In countries like Norway, Sweden, and Iceland, the Viking past was celebrated as a foundation for modern nationhood. Within this nationalist revival, Viking women were often romanticized or instrumentalized as icons of purity, strength, or virtue, fitting contemporary ideals rather than historical realities. For example, the figure of the shieldmaiden women warriors who fought alongside men became a popular trope in literature and art, symbolizing a heroic past that valorized martial prowess and nationalistic strength. This image, while rooted in some saga references and archaeological debates, was frequently exaggerated or simplified to serve political narratives that sought to inspire patriotism at the same time. Victorian and early 20th century scholarship often marginalized women's roles, framing Viking society as predominantly patriarchal and male-dominated. This perspective overshadowed evidence of women's significant social, legal, and economic influence, instead focusing on male explorers, raiders, and rulers. Such bias reflected broader cultural assumptions of the period, limiting historical interpretations. The rise of popular culture in recent decades has continued this complex interplay of myth and reality. Television series, films, novels, and video games frequently depict Viking women through the lens of modern gender politics or entertainment demands. Some portrayals celebrate female strength and independence, aligning with contemporary feminist ideals, while others lean heavily on stereotypes of the seductive or fierce Viking woman. This cultural fascination has revived interest in Viking women but often blurs historical accuracy. The nuanced roles women held as household leaders, traders, ritual specialists, and community diplomats can be overshadowed by sensationalized images of battle-ready shield maidens or tragic princesses. Popular media's selective focus sometimes perpetuates misunderstandings rather than deepening knowledge. Despite these distortions, the real legacies of Viking women endure in subtler but no less profound ways. One of the most tangible is the linguistic heritage passed down through maternal lines. Icelandic, remarkably preserved from Old Norse, retains much of the vocabulary and grammatical structures of Viking speech. This linguistic continuity offers a living connection to the past, with Icelandic women historically key transmitters of language and culture within families. Beyond language, maternal genealogies have been meticulously recorded in Icelandic sagas and church records, preserving the lineage of families for centuries. These maternal lines illuminate the pivotal roles women played in maintaining kinship ties and cultural memory, often serving as anchors in times of change. In Icelandic culture, many traditions and social customs trace back to Viking times, sustained and adapted by women through generations. Seasonal festivals, folk remedies, and storytelling are infused with echoes of Norse beliefs and practices, demonstrating how women acted as custodians of cultural heritage. Archaeological and genetic studies further reinforce women's enduring legacy. Analysis of ancient DNA reveals patterns of migration and settlement that highlight women's participation in Viking expansion. Far from passive followers, Viking women traveled, settled, and contributed to the genetic and cultural fabric of new lands. Moreover, historical research increasingly recognizes the complexity of Viking women's lives, moving beyond stereotypes toward nuanced appreciation of their varied experiences. This scholarship incorporates archaeological evidence, legal texts, and saga literature to reconstruct a more accurate and multifaceted picture. Understanding the legacy of Viking women also means confronting the limitations of surviving sources. Much of what we know comes from male-authored texts, often written centuries after the Viking Age. Archaeology provides physical traces but cannot fully capture lived experience. Recognizing these gaps is essential to avoid projecting modern assumptions onto the past. This ongoing dialogue between myth, scholarship, and popular culture invites reflection on how history is constructed and remembered. Viking women's stories are not static relics but dynamic narratives shaped by the needs and values of each era that retells them. Their legacy challenges us to question how gender and power have been represented historically and how these representations influence contemporary understandings. It also highlights the importance of interdisciplinary approaches that combine literature, archaeology, anthropology, and genetics to enrich our knowledge. Ultimately, the echoes of Viking women resonate far beyond the fjords and burial mounds of their time. They inhabit the collective imagination, cultural memory, and scholarly inquiry, reminding us that history is both lived and told. Through this lens, Viking women emerge not merely as figures of legend or stereotypes, but as real agents whose lives and legacies continue to shape identity, culture, and understanding. Their stories offer a bridge between past and present, inviting us to appreciate the depth and diversity of human experience across time.